Hello and welcome to the latest dose of science news from New Scientist. I'm Penny Sarche, joined by Rowan Hooper.
Hello.
Hello. We've got a food special this week, or maybe a consumption special is a better way to put it. We're looking at why some people put weight back on after they've lost it. And we're also going to be talking about the effect those labels next to food or menus have, you know, the ones that show you the calorie content. And we're also going to hear about quite a strange, possibly terrifying, new AI study showing that a version of ChatGPT is able to replicate people's unique thoughts and personalities.
Do I need to sort of prod you to show everyone that we're really human?
You've known me long enough.
I know you, but how do they know that we're real? And we're going to need a watermark or some sort of equivalent.
This is the future, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, so we're going to go to the future later. We're going to start with the past, our evolutionary past, chimpanzee culture. There's a story this week on chimpanzee culture, and it gets to something that's really puzzled me, actually. And that is the fact that chimps have tools. We've known that since Jane Goodall's legendary studies 60 years ago. And we know they have culture. But their culture's static, right? They've had tools and culture for millions of years, but they're stuck. It's like we had the Stone Age and then we invented, controlled fire, and before you know it, we're on the moon, right?
Yeah.
But chimps have just been stuck in the Stone Age.
Yeah, I've never thought about it like that.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, that's the thing. No one really knew, but we've got a clue to it this week. And I've been talking to some primatologists about it, and we're going to hear from them. But first, we're going to hear from reporter Krista Leste-Lasserre. She's here to tell us about it. Hi, Krista, welcome to the pod.
Hi.
So go on, give us an intro to this study.
So as you say, the question is about chimp culture, but not so much why they're in the Stone Age, or you might even call it the Plant Age, since most of the tools are made from sticks and leaves, which has historically actually made their evolution tough to study. But rather, it's about whether chimp cultures may evolve cumulatively, much as human cultures do. The assumption across many research groups has been that they just don't, but now a big study looking at 35 chimpanzee study sites across Africa suggests that there is a generational buildup of culture.
Oh, well, that's brilliant, because that's just another assumption about chimpanzees that gets completely thrown out. That's exciting.
Yeah, and it's not just a generational buildup, but the idea that only we have the ability to develop more complex cultures over time. I mean, yes, we know that many animals are capable of what we call social learning, where they learn by watching each other. And that sort of thing can get passed on to other animals of the same and later generation. But that's very different from saying, okay, we've got this one skill that we know how to do and it works really well, but how about improving on that and making it better? And for the most part, scientists have believed that this is something that really distinguishes humans from other species.
So I spoke to Andrew Whiten of the University of St Andrews about this, and I asked him about what we know about how chimp culture develops, and here he is.
Some of the chimpanzees' most complex technologies involve what we call tool sets, where they use two or more tools for the job. For example, in the Congo region, they do this to feed on underground termite nests. First, they get a stout stick and they stab it right down through the hard earth, sometimes as far as 0.5 metre, to create a tunnel down to the nest. Then they get a different thing, a long plant stem. They strip that through their teeth to fray the end into a little brush. And they wet that, form it into a kind of point, and then they carefully feed that down the tunnel. The termites bite the invading brush tip, and the chimpanzee then carefully pulls out the tool and eats the termites. If you can imagine you're a primatologist observing this, you can't help but suspect that all this didn't just spring up in one go. Instead, it's probably a culture that has had to be built up over stages. The problem with that is that these tools are all perishable. So we don't have any record of their past history like we do for, say, the wheel or many other examples in human culture. And that's where our new study comes in, because it uses modern genetics to provide us with a kind of time machine to look back into the past. It's based on the fact that in chimpanzees, sexually mature females who migrate to breed in other groups, that's their way of avoiding incest, but it spreads their genes between groups so that over centuries those genes spread far and wide, but those female chimpanzees could also spread their native cultures. For example, if they're one of those who have that skill to use a tool set to get underground termites, they might take that to a group that's ignorant of it. So what this new study has done is to measure where distant communities share those genetic similarities and ask whether they're also likely to share cultural similarities, because migrating females spread both their genes and their cultural knowledge. And sure enough, we found that that was strongly the case for those complex tool sets. It was rather less so where only a single tool is used compared to foraging without tools. So what this suggests is that inventing those complex tool sets is achieved only rarely, and for a community to show it, they usually have to have learned it from a knowledgeable migrating female.
Yeah, so essentially they have these multi-tools that seem to just build up from simple tools. And the scientists here have very cleverly used genetics to map the way these chimps spread with the way culture spreads. And they were taking advantage of methods that scientists have already used to study cumulative culture in ancient hunter-gatherer groups.
Yeah, so that's why he says that it's effectively a time machine to look in a window onto the past.
Yeah, exactly. And you can sort of trace the genetic link from simple tool use to more complex ones, because essentially what they're seeing is that there aren't any particular genetic links among chimps who don't use tools. And then there are some links, they're fairly weak, but they're still there, among those that are using simple tools. And then we get to the complex tools. And those are 3 to 5 times more likely to be associated with sharing genes among those who use them. So we're really seeing that evolution there.
Yeah, there's so many lots of fascinating things about this work. And well, just as an aside, the lead author, this is just a nice aside, the lead author is Cassandra Gunasekaram of the University of Zurich. She was only a PhD student when she started, and this is her first paper, and it's in Science. So, yeah.
It kind of makes you a god among men, doesn't it, if you get a Nature or a Science paper
Starting
from your
at the
PhD.
Top. Yeah. So I spoke to Cassandra as well about the work, and I asked her why it's taken us so long to figure this out, seeing as we've known about chimps and tool use for so long, and here she is.
Cumulative culture has been studied a lot in humans, and only recently our group has worked on cultural exchange and mobility patterns in hunter-gatherers using similar genetic data. And that study had showed that the hunter-gatherers from the west to the east of the Congo Basin have been connected through migrations between groups over the past 5,000 years at least, and that these connections correlated with cultural exchange of, for example, musical instruments. So when this genetic data came out for chimpanzees, just when I had started my PhD, we wanted to try this and see if we can find some correlation in chimpanzees as well. I really think that we were very lucky because previously this data just didn't exist yet, but now we have this huge genetic database that comes from collected poo. When we then actually found the correlation between migration patterns and complex tools in chimpanzees, this was of course very exciting, and now having my first PhD chapter published in Science is just amazing, and I am very grateful to everyone that contributed to this paper. Also, I am very excited to now continue this work, and we wanted to quantify the differences in migration patterns between humans and chimpanzees, and then further analyze the complexification of culture to have a proper understanding of the differences in these processes that correlate with cumulative culture in these two species.
Yeah, exactly. So essentially, they just didn't have the data to do this kind of research. That's really why it has taken so long to get there. But now our own cumulative culture, I guess you could say, has led us to be able to do the genetic analyses and even create these huge data banks of genetic information and make it accessible to scientists around the world. And before that, as Andrew was saying, they just didn't have the chimps' archaeological artifacts around because, the vast majority were made from plants that just degraded out of visible history.
Yeah, and actually we just had a story about that in New Scientist about the Botanic Age, about where our ancestors used plant-based tools and the new discoveries that are being made about that. But look, there's still the question of given this work, so we know now that chimps can evolve their own cultures in a cumulative way that we thought only humans did. So why are they still scrabbling around in the dirt, and why haven't they made particle accelerators yet? When people usually tackle that question. It's about us. It's like, well, we're better.
Human-centric.
But here's a nice way around to look at it. And this is from Andrea Migliano. She's a member of the research team that put this paper out, also from Zurich.
Over the millions of years that separated hunter-gatherers from chimpanzees in the human foraging niche, there was strong selection to access difficult-to-acquire resources. So this meant that humans became very dependent on tool use. While chimpanzees are proficient in using tools and they use it very regularly, they are not dependent on that in the same way. Some populations of chimpanzees survive without the use of any tool for foraging. On top of that, humans also had to become very cooperative, cooperating, for instance, to access these resources to cooperative hunting. And the combination of these two factors meant that human sociality became very fluid, with hunter-gatherers nowadays, living today, moving very often between camps to visit friends and to find cooperators, and also, of course, to access these resources. So this exactly process of migration between camps bring the possibility to recombine information and produce new tools and creates what we call cumulative culture, which is this culture that is so complex that no single individual can recreate from zero. So what I think we show in this paper that is really cool is that the origins of this cumulative culture process was probably already in the common ancestor between humans and chimpanzees. Chimpanzees have very limited tool use and also very limited between-group migration, but they do have both. And this migration is already enough for the beginning of cumulative culture to evolve there.
Now, when the penny dropped for me, the penny dropped.
No, yeah, I never heard that one before.
I didn't mean to. was when it said that chimps aren't dependent on tools like we are. So they haven't needed to do anything else selectively.
It speaks to that thing that, for a very long time in human history, we've seen ourselves as like the pinnacle of evolution, but chimps are the best at being chimps.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're not as social. And then the other really important point is our cooperation, right? That we're super cooperative.
Yeah, we are. And of course, we've also developed this complex spoken and written language, right? I mean, that has really helped share our knowledge far and wide. So beyond that, I think that maybe we ourselves understand the benefit of sharing our knowledge and skills towards some greater and wider reaching goal.
And the goal of this podcast is to make more people go to look at New Scientist. That's the pinnacle here. Well, what it reminds me of is how that the idea that you get more innovation in cities, in human culture, because of the greater mixing of ideas. And it kind of seems like in chimp populations, where you get this multi-tool use building up, they're like prototypes of cities, of like centres of innovation, where you get this crossover of ideas.
Yeah, well, they certainly could be, but I think it's important to keep in mind that, like Andrew told me, chimp cumulative culture remains very, quote, tiny, he said, compared to our own. So I don't think we can expect them to be, creating an industrial revolution in their communities, and they're not going to be inventing computers anytime soon.
Thanks so much, Krista.
Thanks, Krista.
Now, are you feeling hungry, Rowan?
Now you mention it.
Once someone asks, right? I could always eat.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I've got plenty for you to tuck into, metaphorically. So we were going to talk about the two studies this week. One's looking at calories and dietary choices, and the other is looking at why when you lose weight, it can often be really, really hard to keep that weight off, and instead you just put it all back on again.
Mm-hmm. Food for thought.
Yeah, see what you did there. Yeah. So first off, I wondered, you know when you see calories on a menu next to a dish, does that influence your choice at all?
If I'm like ravenously hungry, it might do. I might choose the one that's...
So you're doing the opposite.
Yeah, I'm doing what you're not supposed to do.
Yeah. I was thinking, I'm not sure it really, like I maybe would factor in, that's a bit more calories, but I'm really not like looking, that's way worse than I expected. I won't eat it then.
Yeah.
So I've been pretty skeptical about this idea of whether putting calories on menus really makes any difference at all.
Yeah.
And that made me interested to see there is a study this week that speaks to that question.
Yeah, so the whole thing came about, certainly in the UK, from when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister. It was something that that they introduced then, right?
Yeah, it was part of this anti-obesity campaign that was launched in 2020. There were other things going on that year. But the idea is that large restaurants or takeaway businesses have to print calories alongside dishes. So, not small independents, but all the sort of mainstream chains. And it follows the same sort of mandatory labelling that you already get in the US.
Okay. And the whole idea, obviously, is part of this nudge thing, isn't it? It's nudging people into what we want them to do.
Yeah, making the right choices.
Yeah.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
But there may well be other effects. People may think about, like you said, if you're really hungry, do you want to maximize how many calories you're going to get? Value for money. Especially at the moment, food is really expensive.
Yeah, I mean, definitely as a student, I would choose the bulk cheap purchases.
Yeah, exactly.
So what do we know about whether it even works or not?
So a study just out this week has modelled the long-term consequences that we might expect for this policy, looking specifically at body mass index and the risk of cardiovascular problems in people in England over a period of 20 years. And the results, as modelled, predicted a decrease in the prevalence of obesity of just 0.31 percentage points and only 730 fewer deaths from cardiovascular disease by 2041.
Wow. So that's a lot of effort for not much.
Yeah, if you think about
payback.
it, the model predicts 830,000 cardiovascular deaths during that time. So while 730 fewer is not nothing, it's, not a big dent. The study did suggest, though, that if the policy was expanded to all restaurants and cafes, like smaller ones, then the model could prevent up to 9,200 deaths. So that's a bit more.
Yeah, okay. I mean, it's hard. It's really hard when you start telling people what they can and can't eat and what restaurants can and can't serve, isn't it? I mean, people love to eat certain things. So it basically means we have to make available the junk food that people like.
Well, right, yeah. And, some people depend on going to, fast food chains. It's their only option, given, the crazy shifts they're working or the strange places they're...
Yeah.
But, when I go out to a restaurant for a treat, the calories doesn't really come into it if it's a one-off.
Yeah.
And also calories aren't the whole story. Some calories are better than others. They might be in far more nutritious foods than a completely processed fast food.
Yeah.
And also, I think one of the problems is that the idea of putting the calories next to items on the menu and thinking that's going to make a meaningful difference, it sort of relies on the idea that people eat unhealthily due to a lack of information or a lack of education. And I'm not sure that's, the big problem here in terms of obesity. But in any case, a survey of 3,000 people before and after this UK legislation went through suggests that having calories on menus made no significant change to people's eating choices.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah. And another study found that a third of the calories printed on the menus aren't actually that accurate. So the guidelines require calories to lie within a 20% margin of error. But one study showed that 35% of the calories printed on sampled menus sat outside of that margin of error. Which sort of makes sense if you think about it. Food isn't this easily standardized, reproducible thing. Not the really good stuff anyway.
Well, so apart from, the fact that they don't make much difference having the labels there, are there people who say they're actually actively harmful having these labels here?
There's an argument that sounds really, it makes sense to me that if you're someone who struggles with disordered eating, like anorexia or bulimia,
the last thing you want to see.
If you're trying not to let food kind of have that sort of triggering hold over you, having the numbers right there next to them, that's not going to be very helpful, is it?
No. Well, so the upshot is there's a lot to weigh up and when the penny drops.
You're going to Rowan back on that one.
Oh.
Hey!
Thinking back, there's a lot to weigh up when you're thinking about whether it's worth doing calorie labelling or not.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, right. There's another food-related story that caught my eye this week, and that's, it's one we've all probably got direct experience of, or we know someone who's experienced this, and that's the fact that some people can't seem to keep weight off when they lose it. They might go through so much hell to get rid of a lot of weight, and then, a few months later it just piles back on.
Yeah, this kind of yo-yo diet thing, it's an extremely well-known phenomenon.
Yeah.
For example, around 85% of people with overweight or obesity who manage to lose at least a tenth of their body weight 85% of those will then regain it within a year. So, you know, this is a big problem for people who really are trying to sort of lose that weight.
Yeah, I mean, it's super hard to stick to watch your calories,
yeah.
really carefully.
And,
for a long
these
time.
horrible sort of really restricted weight loss diets.
Yeah.
And it is miserable to be hungry all the time. But that's not the whole story either. And we know that it's not just about sort of willpower. Studies have also shown that the brain interprets a sharp drop in body fat as dangerous and responds by making the body burn less energy, and that can potentially cause the body to store up more fat again. So to learn more about these kinds of processes that might be happening, researchers have now analysed fat tissue collected from 20 people with obesity just before they had bariatric surgery, which shrinks the stomach to make people feel fuller sooner and is quite an effective way of losing a lot of weight. And then they looked at these fat cells again 2 years later when they had lost at least a quarter of their initial body weight. And then for comparison, they also looked at fat tissue from 18 people with a healthy weight.
Okay.
And so when they compared those two groups before the surgery, they found that the activity of more than 100 genes differed between them, between their fat cells, and that these differences remained when they looked again 2 years later after the bariatric surgery.
Wow. So 2 years later, the bodies of previously obese people are still behaving differently.
Yeah, essentially, it's
Wow.
quite astonishing,
Yeah,
isn't it?
yeah.
And it looks like these differences might be increased with things like increased inflammation, disruption to how fat cells store and burn fat. And so you could see how those potentially maybe raise the risk of gaining weight again, although this experiment didn't sort of go and show and prove that.
Okay, and so obviously the big question is, can you change gene activity? Can you row it back in that group?
Well, the answer currently, if you want to actually kind of target those specific genes, is no. Further experiments in mice suggest that the changes in gene activity that were seen in this experiment are probably due to epigenetics. So that's, changes on the outside of the DNA that affects how active genes are. And we don't really have a way to sort of precision tweak that yet. But I don't think that means the situation is necessarily hopeless. Our epigenome, it changes in response to experience and environment. So even though, it's still behaving the same way 2 years later, that's not to say it wouldn't change at some point. And potentially future studies could have a look at what happens over a longer period, or if there are sort of environmental ways that we could sort of shift that gene activity the way that you want it to go.
Yeah. All right, since we're talking about obesity and weight loss, like the big drug at the moment is Ozempic. The other one is Wegovy. Those are these glucagon-like peptide-1 analogs, GLP-1, very big name drugs at the moment. How do they fit into all this?
Yeah, I mean, people are seeing significant weight loss. There's a lot of excitement about it. It's still sort of relatively early days. We don't know long term, are people going to have to take these forever? But I think when you sort of look at this picture as a whole, what really stands out to me is that the tools that we currently have that we know are really good at a large amount of weight loss, bariatric surgery, and now these GLP-1 analogs, these approaches probably work for a variety of reasons, but one thing that really stands out to me is that they all reduce appetite. And we live in these very obesogenic environments now.
Yeah.
We're pretty sedentary, we're short on time and money, unhealthy foods are often the cheapest and most available. So if you think about, telling someone how many calories are in something, it's hard to see how that's going to have a big effect if somebody's body is working in a way that is just driving them to feel really hungry and put that weight on.
Now, for this next story, I'm going to break a rule of talking about stories in New Scientist, which is we're never normally allowed to invoke science fiction. But this one, I just can't help it because, you'll see why. So this is computer scientists at Stanford, and they've got this version of ChatGPT to simulate 1,000 real people and basically create digital twins of them. And then when you test the AI version later, this digital twin manages to just replicate your personality, and really quite accurately. Jacob Aaron's here to tell us about it. Jacob, look, he's on the screen. It could not be.
It could not be him.
We'll take your word for it that it's you. But
I promise you, I'm not a deep fake.
That's what they'd say.
Tell us about this story then.
So the idea is that they've used GPT-4o, which is the kind of most advanced version of ChatGPT, to interview people for 2 hours. And this is a voice interview. So people are essentially just sort of naturally speaking and having the AI talk back to them. And using the transcript that they get from that interview, they then feed it back into the AI and are able to generate a replica of that person.
Okay, so often when you're looking at like personality in people, you use like a really standard questionnaire. But what they've done here is rather than using like a generic form, they've actually had like a chat with the GPT model to sort of build up a view of their personality.
Yeah, so the AI was sort of given a list of standard questions to ask and work through, but it could deviate from them. And, you know, if the interviewee said something in particular, the AI was then able to respond to it in the way that you wouldn't normally get if you're just filling out a form. And after doing this for 2 hours, they then ran the AIs through a variety of tests. And when they gave the same tests to the original humans, they found that the AIs were able to replicate their answers with 85% accuracy.
If you've done this and you've set up the AI model, Jacob, right? Supposing they did one of me and then they asked my replica, what does Rowan think about, what do you think about, say, laws against assisted dying, which is a big thing at the moment. Lots of people, you know, lots of things in the news about it. Would it give a similar response to the real me? Or, you know, is that what they're able to do yet?
So I think it's hard to say whether it would be completely accurate. You know, if the AI Rowan would say exactly what you would say. But for example, part of the interview involved asking people's views on healthcare, you know, their sort of life experience, which will include people dying, their views on vaccines, alternative medicine. And you could imagine how with all of that information, you could infer what someone's views towards assisted dying might be, just based on sort of, you could cluster people together. You know, if you have particular views on healthcare, you're also perhaps going to have particular views on assisted dying.
Yeah. Is this a terrifying thing? Why are they doing this?
So the goal of the research is to replace existing models that are used for forecasting policy changes. So at the moment, say you want to come up with a new law or a tax change, and you want to know how that's going to affect the general population, you might look at a demographic model, say. So you could say, well, for people who live in cities versus people who live in the country, people of certain ages, certain backgrounds, this is how they might respond. And you can sort of feed that into the model and see what their reaction to your policy is going to be. Obviously, all of that involves quite a lot of averaging and guesswork. So the hope is, with something like this, by more closely replicating individuals, and I should say that the 1,000 or so people they interviewed were representative of the US population. By interviewing these people and being able to replicate their answers in more detail, you could then be able to get sort of more subtle responses to proposed policy changes.
Should we worry about the ethics of this, like potentially the ability to sort of replicate human personalities or their emotions? That could be a goldmine for all sorts of reasons. I guess marketing is the first one that springs to mind.
So, I imagine marketers would absolutely love to have this. The researchers behind the work said they've been really, really aware about ethics throughout the whole experiment. You know, they've been sort of in constant communication with their ethical oversight board. They've put in various controls so that if someone who took part in this interview now says, oh, I don't want to be involved anymore, they can retract their consent, they can delete the model. But I think it is a bit of a genie out the bottle moment, as you say. Now that someone's shown that this is possible, it basically involves just using ChatGPT and tools that are readily available. And if you were willing to, you know, pay the people to do their interviews and things like that, I don't see why you couldn't replicate this. Obviously, there are sort of data protection laws and things like that, but those vary from country to country.
I mean, I can see this becoming quite normal quite quickly, and then we'll get used to maybe we'll get used to these things around. And also, you know, we project a lot onto, even, very obviously non-human robots and, vacuum cleaners and assign them agency. You can imagine all the more so in something that's very much at upper level. We're going to start assuming these are real or conscious, right?
So I don't know whether it actually appears more conscious than ChatGPT already does. It's more specific, I suppose, more tailored to an individual, but it's going to be just as fluent as ChatGPT already is. And actually, we had a study earlier this year showing that 20% of people in the US actually already think that ChatGPT is sentient. I would say most researchers would say that it is very much not, but you can see how in the public perception it does appear to be this sort of conscious thing that you can interact with.
Well, I mean, and also as these get more complex, I could see you can start to make an argument that you might as well call them conscious.
I mean, your mind very quickly goes to that Black Mirror scenario, right? Of you don't even realize you've been replicated and you're stuck on a server somewhere. Yeah. When Chris Stoker-Walker, the reporter who wrote this story for us, kind of asked the researchers about this, it was not a question they wanted to engage with much, as you can imagine. I mean, they're very much more focused on the data privacy angle of things, which I think is important. Normally, if you take part in research, your data might be sort of anonymized, averaged in some way. With this, the goal very explicitly is to try and replicate an individual. And so there are data privacy questions and things like that. When it comes to saying, are these conscious? I think it's really difficult, right? Like, as I say, I don't think it's any more conscious than ChatGPT is normally. And I would say ChatGPT is currently not conscious.
Yeah. Can I just pour a bunch of cold water on this for a moment? First off, I don't know how it comes when you're doing marketing or political modelling, but from, say, a biomedical perspective, 85% accurate is not accurate. That's not particularly useful. And also the thing that I thought was really stark about this is that just 2 weeks later, real people, when they were answering the same questions again, answered them differently 19% of the time. So people are really variable, and we know about that from psychology. We change our minds from one moment to the next. And so doesn't that actually suggest that AI models aren't really useful in this way, Jacob?
Well, that's really interesting, right? Because in one way, and it's sort of described in this way in the researcher's paper, people are bad models of themselves. So people were 80% accurate at repeating what they'd said 2 weeks ago. And so then the AI was 85% accurate, sort of repeating their answers over those 2 weeks. I think what's interesting is they did a comparison to those more sort of demographic models I was talking about earlier, and they found that the accuracy did increase by 14 percentage points. So there was a benefit to doing this AI version rather than the more simplistic demographic modeling.
You could record a version of yourself when you're young and idealistic and save that nice young, idealistic version before you become old and jaded. I'm not speaking from personal experience here. But
I like the way you're saying you.
One could. And also, I don't want to get too Black Mirror-ish, but, you could also see how you could chat to someone after they're dead very, very easily, right? If this gets a bit better. And if you spoke to one of these models for more than 2 hours, extensively, then you could perhaps get a really good model of them that, it might be a world leader, not just a loved one that you might want to talk to. So there's a lot of mad possibilities, aren't there?
Well, there's a few things to unpack there. So first of all, would talking for longer than 2 hours actually provide more gains? In a way, this is one of the biggest questions about AI at the moment. Can you continue scaling? The more data you feed into an AI, does it get more and more accurate, or do we hit a ceiling at some point? So they've not done the experiment yet, and it might be that, the gains after 2 hours are not much more. The other thing to keep in mind, and coming back to this idea that, people are not necessarily good models of themselves, is that we actually do a lot of work filling in the blanks. So take mediums and psychics. They can really convince people that they know their deep, dark secrets when actually they've just got a few basic facts, and then your mind fills in the rest, and you go, oh yeah, my dead uncle would have said that. So I don't see why we wouldn't do the same thing with AI. And in a way, obviously these are really impressive technological tools, but a lot of the magic sort of goes on in our own brains as much as they're going on in the software.
I'm not quite sure how that reassures me or not, but thanks, Jacob. That's great. Look, that's it for this week. Thanks to our guests. Thanks to you for listening. Do tell all your friends about us. Give us a 5-star rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, everywhere.
We'll be back next week. Bye-bye for now.
Bye.